I didn't leave work early because I was sick. I left because I felt hollow, like something inside me had already quit and my body was just catching up. The office lights were too bright that afternoon. Not in the way they usually are, but sharp, invasive, like they were trying to expose something I'd been hiding from myself. My screen glowed with emails I hadn't answered and deadlines I'd promised to meet with a confidence I no longer felt. Every notification felt like a reminder that I was replaceable, that if I vanished tomorrow, someone younger and cheaper would slide into my chair by Monday. I stared at my reflection in the black edge of the monitor. 36 years old. A decent title. A mortgage. A wife. A son. On paper, I'd won. Inside, I felt like a man who'd missed the exit and kept driving because turning around would mean admitting it. My chest tightened. Not a heart attack, something quieter. Heavier. The kind of pressure that builds when you swallow too much for too long. I told my manager I wasn't feeling well. He nodded without looking up, already half forgetting me. That should have bothered me more than it did. The drive home blurred past in fragments. Red lights, billboards promising better lives, my phone buzzing with a message from my wife I didn't read. I kept thinking about my son. About how lately, when I came home, he'd look up from his toys like he was checking to see which version of me walked through the door. The distracted one. The tired one. Or the one who smiled too wide and asked questions he didn't have the energy to hear the answers to. The house was quiet when I pulled into the driveway. Too quiet for a weekday afternoon. No TV. No music. Just the low hum of something electrical beneath the walls. I stepped inside and the smell hit me first. Cleaning spray, sharp and lemony, layered over something older. The kind of smell that tries too hard to cover what's underneath. Hello. My voice echoed back at me, thin and uncertain. My wife's shoes were by the door. My mother-in-law's coat hung neatly on the rack, like she planned to stay a while. That tightened something in my stomach. She'd been staying with us more often lately. Always with a reason. Always with an opinion. I set my keys down and that's when I heard it. It was faint, almost polite. The kind of sound you'd miss if you were distracted, which I usually was. I froze. Another scratch followed, longer this time. Nails on drywall. Slow. Deliberate. My first thought was the obvious one. Rats. Old house. Winter coming. My second thought was less rational and harder to name. The sound stopped when I moved closer to the hallway. I stood there, listening to my own breathing, suddenly aware of how loud it was. I pressed my palm against the wall. Solid. Normal. Dad. I turned. My son stood at the end of the hallway, clutching his dinosaur like a shield. His eyes flicked past me, toward the wall, then back to my face. Hey, buddy, I said, forcing my voice into something light. You scared me. He didn't smile. Why are you home? He asked. The question shouldn't have stung. But it did. I wasn't feeling good, I said. Thought I'd come hang out with you. He nodded, but his shoulders stayed tight. Like he was bracing for something. From the kitchen, my wife appeared, wiping her hands on a towel. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. I don't know. I heard something in the wall. She didn't even pause. It's rats, she said. Too quickly. Old houses have them. Mom said she heard them last night too. As if summoned by her name, my mother-in-law stepped into the doorway. She looked at me the way she always did, like she was assessing damage. You shouldn't scare the boy, she said calmly. Men hear noises and think it's the end of the world. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. I'd learned over the years that pushing back only turned into lectures about how sensitive I was. How stressed. How unreliable. The scratching didn't come back. We ate dinner early. My son barely touched his food. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the hallway. Toward the wall. You want dessert? My wife asked him. He shook his head. Can I sleep in your room tonight? He asked me quietly. My wife laughed. He's too old for that. I felt something twist in my chest. Just tonight, I said. My mother-in-law smiled thinly. Children need structure, she said. Not indulgence. I watched my son retreat into himself at that word. Indulgence. As if comfort was a bad habit. That night, after everyone went to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My wife's breathing was steady beside me. My son's room was dark and silent down the hall. Fresh. My heart kicked. Fresh. Fresh. It was louder now. Closer. I slipped out of bed and stood in the hallway, my bare feet cold against the floor. The sound was unmistakable. Not random. Not frantic. Intentional. I leaned close to the wall and whispered, "Hello." The scratching stopped. I stood there for a long time, longer than I want to admit, until the house settled and silence filled the space again. I told myself it was nothing. That I was overtired. That stress was making me paranoid. That's what men like me do. We explain things away because acknowledging them would mean acting, and acting means risking everything we've built our lives around. I went back to bed and stared into the dark, replaying the day. The office. The drive. The look on my son's face. Just before sleep took me, a thought surfaced that wouldn't let go. If it was just rats, why did it stop when I listened? The house went quiet again. But I didn't sleep. And somewhere inside the wall, something waited. By morning, I had convinced myself I was wrong. That's the talent adulthood gives you if you practice it long enough. The ability to sand down fear until it fits neatly into logic. By the time sunlight crept through the blinds, the scratching had become rats, stress, imagination. A story with edges dull enough to live with. I stood in the shower longer than usual, letting hot water pound against my back, trying to rinse away the feeling that something had watched me all night. My reflection in the fogged mirror looked older than it should have. Eyes rimmed red, jaw tight, like a man bracing for impact he couldn't see coming. At breakfast, my son barely spoke. He pushed his cereal around with his spoon, tracing slow circles like he was buying time. "Big test today?" I asked, reaching for normal. He shrugged. My wife stood at the counter scrolling through her phone, already half somewhere else. My mother-in-law sat at the table, posture straight, hands folded, watching everything. She had a way of being present without participating. Like a judge who never announced the verdict but made sure you felt it. "You didn't sleep?" she said, eyes on me. "I'm fine," I replied. She nodded, satisfied. As if that was the correct answer. I walked my son to the door for school. As I bent to tie his shoe, my hand brushed his wrist. He flinched. Too fast. "Hey," I said gently, taking his hand. "What's that?" There were faint marks on his skin. Like pressure had been applied too long. He pulled his arm back. "Nothing." My wife appeared instantly. "He was playing yesterday," she said. "Kids get marks. Don't interrogate him." Her tone wasn't angry. It was final. I let it go. That decision sat in my chest all day like a stone. After I dropped him off, I didn't go back to work. I drove aimlessly, phone buzzing with messages I ignored. At a red light, I typed, "Scratching in wall stops when you approach," into my phone. I hated myself for doing it. The internet gave me answers that sounded reasonable enough to cling to. Rodents. Thermal expansion. Every explanation ended with some version of "don't worry." So why did my hands shake when I locked the phone? When I got home, the house smelled different. Sharper. Bleach this time. My mother-in-law's cleaning day. She stood in the hallway near the wall. "Working from home now?" she asked. "Just today." She smiled. Men like you never know when to stay put. I didn't know what she meant, but it stuck to me anyway. The scratching didn't happen all afternoon. Instead, other things did. Doors closed softly where I didn't remember opening them. My son asked permission before speaking, like he was afraid sound itself might get him in trouble. When my wife touched my arm, it felt more like a warning than affection. At dinner, my mother-in-law locked the hallway door. "That door sticks," she said when she saw me notice. "Safety hazard." I nodded. Because that's what I did. I nodded through discomfort, through doubt, through the quiet erosion of my own instincts. Later that night, as I tucked my son into bed, he grabbed my sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, eyes darting toward the wall. "If I tell you something, you won't get mad?" My chest tightened. "Never." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind." I sat there longer than necessary, watching him breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest like proof he was still okay. When I stood to leave, something slipped from his pillow and landed on the floor. A folded piece of paper. I picked it up after he fell asleep. My hands felt clumsy unfolding it, like I already knew I shouldn't read what was inside. It was a drawing. The hallway. The wall. A dark space behind it. And two stick figures. One was small. One was tall. The tall one had no face. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Don't let her hear us." My mouth went dry. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at that wall like it might blink back at me. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I knocked lightly. I jumped back, heart slamming against my ribs. Another scratch followed. Slow. Careful. Like a response. "Who's there?" I whispered. Silence. Behind me, a voice said, "Talking to the walls now?" I turned. My mother-in-law stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, expression calm. Curious. "It's rats," she said before I could speak. "You need to stop feeding your imagination. That's how men lose their families." Something about the way she said lose chilled me. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat on the couch with the lights off, listening. Waiting. Every sound felt amplified. The refrigerator hum. The tick of the clock. My own pulse. Just after midnight, the scratching started again. Not frantic. Rhythmic. I stood slowly, like any sudden movement might break some unspoken rule. As I stepped closer, the scratching stopped. I pressed my palm against the wall. "Dad?" my son whispered from the darkness behind me. I turned. He stood there barefoot, eyes wide. "She said you wouldn't believe me," he said. My throat closed. "Who did?" He shook his head. "I can't say it out loud." Behind us, somewhere deep inside the wall, something shifted. And for the first time, the sound didn't fade when I listened. It stayed. Waiting. There's a moment when doubt stops protecting you and starts endangering you. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment came the second the sound stayed. I stood there in the hallway with my son behind me, his small fingers wrapped in the back of my shirt, and listened to the wall breathe. That's the only word that fits. It wasn't scratching anymore. It was movement with intention. A presence aware of mine. "Go to your room," I whispered. He shook his head, grip tightening. "I can't." That word hit harder than I expected. I looked down at him, really looked this time. The dark circles under his eyes. The way his shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller. I'd been mistaking silence for calm. Obedience for safety. I had been wrong. I guided him back to his room and sat him on the bed. "Stay here," I said more firmly than before. "I'll be right outside." He nodded, but his eyes followed me like he didn't believe me. In the hallway, I knocked once. The wall answered. Not with chaos. Not with panic. 3 slow scratches. My skin prickled. I knocked again. 3 scratches back. A pattern. My mouth went dry. "Who are you?" I said, my voice barely steady. Silence. Then, something slid downward inside the wall. A soft, weighted sound, like fabric against wood. Behind me, the bedroom door creaked. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. I turned. She stood there in her robe, arms crossed, eyes sharp with irritation rather than concern. "You're scaring him," she said. "I think someone's in the wall," I replied. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "Listen to yourself." "I am listening," I said. "That's the problem." My mother-in-law appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the tension like she always was. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked curious. Interested. "You've always had a dramatic streak," she said calmly. "Men who feel powerless at work tend to look for threats at home." That landed exactly where it was meant to. I felt the familiar urge to shrink. To apologize. To restore order by making myself smaller. Instead, I looked back at the wall. "Did you hear that?" I asked my wife. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then shook her head. "You're exhausted. You need sleep." That hesitation mattered. I waited until they went back to bed. Or pretended to. The house settled into that deceptive nighttime quiet, where every sound feels intentional because you're finally paying attention. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, knees pulled to my chest, like a man guarding a door he didn't fully understand. I thought about work, about how often I'd let things slide because confronting them felt riskier than enduring them, about how being the provider had become my excuse for being absent. Around 1 in the morning, the wall spoke again. I didn't move. Listen, I whispered. If you can hear me, knock. Nothing. I exhaled, feeling foolish. Knock. From inside the wall. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was careful. Like whoever, or whatever, was in there didn't want to be heard by anyone else. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. Are you alone? I whispered. The pause. Then a faint scraping that moved upward. Higher. Toward my son's room. Something inside me snapped into place. Not panic. Not rage. Resolve. I stood and went to the garage, every step deliberate. I passed the toolbox. The ladder. The shelves lined with things I'd fixed instead of what needed fixing. My hand closed around the sledgehammer. It felt heavier than I remembered. Solid. Honest. When I came back inside, my wife was waiting at the end of the hallway. Put that down, she said. Why? Because you're crossing a line. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. That line's already been crossed. She stepped closer. You do this and there's no going back. I looked at her, really looked, and realized she wasn't afraid of the damage to the house. She was afraid of what I'd see. From the kitchen, my mother-in-law watched silently, arms folded, lips curved in something that almost resembled a smile. Break things, she said softly. That's what men like you do. I tightened my grip on the handle. Maybe, I replied. But tonight I'm listening. I raised the hammer. The first strike cracked drywall and sent dust into the air. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. My wife gasped. My son cried out from his room. Dad! I'm here, I called back without turning. The second strike broke through completely. Behind the wall was an insulation. It was space. A narrow cavity framed by studs. Unfinished. And something moved inside it. My breath caught. It's okay, I said, though I didn't know who I was talking to anymore. You're safe. A shape retreated deeper into the darkness. Stop, my wife whispered. Please. I swung again. The hammer hit wood. Not a stud. Something else. A low, muffled sound followed. Not animal. Human. My hands began to shake. From behind me, my mother-in-law spoke for the first time since I'd started. You weren't supposed to see this, she said calmly. I turned on her. See what? She tilted her head. How discipline actually works. I faced the wall again and tore away more drywall with my hands, ignoring the sting as skin scraped raw. The opening widened. Light spilled into the cavity. My son's eyes stared back at me. For a second, my mind refused to process it. Tried to reorder reality into something survivable. Then he blinked. Daddy, he whispered. He was wedged between the studs, knees pulled to his chest, wrists bound with fabric I recognized as one of his bedsheets. His face was pale. His lips cracked. I don't remember screaming. I remember dropping to my knees. I'm here, I said, voice breaking. I've got you. As I reached in, his fingers clutched mine with desperate strength. Daddy, he whispered again, eyes flicking downward. I'm not alone in here. Something shifted beneath him. And from the darkness below the floor line, a slow breath answered. Behind me, the house went silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Because whatever had been hidden in that wall had finally been seen. And nothing would ever fit back together the way it was. I didn't know rage could be so quiet. I'd always imagined anger as something loud, shouting, broken furniture, fists through walls. But what filled me in that moment was colder, heavier, like something ancient settling into my bones and deciding it was done waiting. My son's fingers were still wrapped around mine, white-knuckled, desperate. His body trembled against the studs as if the wall itself had learned how to hurt him. I leaned closer, blocking the light with my body, trying to make myself the only thing he could see. "It's okay," I whispered. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." Behind me, the silence felt staged. My wife stood frozen a few feet back, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. My mother-in-law didn't move at all. She simply watched, eyes sharp, calculating, as if she were observing the outcome of an experiment. "You need to step away," my wife said softly. "You're making this worse." Worse. I almost laughed. I reached into the wall and began working at the fabric around my son's wrists. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort it took not to tear everything apart at once. The knot was tight. Purposeful. Whoever tied it wanted it to hold. "Don't," my mother-in-law said. The word wasn't a plea. It was a command. I ignored her. As the knot loosened, my son sucked in a sharp breath, like he'd been holding it for days. I pulled him free inch by inch, careful not to hurt him, whispering nonsense words just to keep him anchored to my voice. Then I felt it. A shift below. A weight redistributing itself. Something alive in the darkness beneath the floorline. My son pressed his face into my chest. "Don't look," he whispered. Too late. The light from the hallway spilled downward, just enough to reveal a second space. Lower, narrower. A crawl space carved where no crawl space should be. I caught the glint of an eye. Not animal. Human. I straightened slowly, pulling my son with me, placing him behind my legs. My body moved before my mind could catch up, positioning itself between him and the opening. "What is that?" I asked. No one answered. My wife's breathing turned shallow. "Please," she said. "Let's talk about this. You're misunderstanding." I turned to her. "How long?" She swallowed. "It's not." "How long?" I repeated. Her eyes flicked to her mother. That was answer enough. My mother-in-law stepped forward, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You weren't meant to find out like this. But since you have, we need to be very clear." "Clear about what?" "About roles," she said. "About control. Children need to learn where they belong. Especially boys." My stomach churned. "This is abuse," I said. She smiled faintly. "This is discipline. Something your generation has forgotten." I felt something in me fracture and reform. "All this time," I said slowly, "you watched me doubt myself. You let me think I was weak." She tilted her head. "You are weak. That's why this worked." I didn't raise my voice. I raised the sledgehammer. The air shifted instantly. My wife cried out. My mother-in-law's smile vanished for the first time. "Put that down," she snapped. "No," I said. "You don't get to give orders anymore." I brought the hammer down on the remaining drywall, widening the opening until the wall was nothing but broken edges and dust. Each swing felt like shedding a layer of skin I'd been wearing to survive. Behind me, my son clung to my leg. I felt his fear, but also something else. "Go outside," I told my wife without looking at her. "Take him. Call the police." She didn't move. I said go. The authority in my voice surprised even me. My mother-in-law took a step toward the hammer. "You think this ends well for you?" she said. "You'll lose your job. Your reputation. Your family." I met her gaze. "If this is what keeping them costs, I'm done paying." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. "I'm calling," I said. My wife shook her head violently. "Please. We can fix this. We'll send him away. Therapy. Somewhere nice. Send him away." I looked down at my son. He looked back at me, eyes clear despite everything. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't asking permission. "No," I said. "This ends tonight." The line rang once. Then twice. As I spoke to the dispatcher, my mother-in-law's composure cracked. Her voice rose. Her hands clenched. The mask slipped, revealing something sharp and ugly underneath. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "I know exactly what I've done," I replied. I listened. Sirens sounded in the distance sooner than I expected. Maybe the neighbors had heard. Maybe someone else had been waiting for an excuse. When the police arrived, the house felt suddenly small. Fragile. like a stage set that couldn't hold up under real light. Officers moved quickly, professionally. Flashlights cut through the darkness behind the wall. I watched as the second figure was pulled from the crawlspace. A man I didn't recognize, thin, shaking, eyes hollow. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. My son pressed his face into my side. "It's over," I told him. But even as I said it, I knew better. This wasn't an ending. It was a crossing. As they led my mother-in-law away, she twisted back toward me. Her eyes burned with something like triumph. "You think you're a hero now," she said. "But you've just taught him to break things." I knelt in front of my son, cupping his face gently, making sure she couldn't reach him with her words. "No," I said quietly. "I taught him to listen to himself." The house was wrecked. The wall destroyed. The life I thought I had taken. But as I wrapped my arms around my son and felt him breathe, really breathe, against me, I understood something with absolute clarity. I hadn't become dangerous because I broke the wall. I had become dangerous because I finally chose to protect what mattered, no matter the cost. And once a man makes that choice, there is no going back. Shock isn't loud. It doesn't scream or thrash. It settles. It turns your thoughts into slow, floating pieces that refuse to connect, like your mind is buying time because it knows what comes next will change everything. I stood there with my arm around my son, watching strangers in uniforms move through my house as if it belonged to someone else. Flashlights cut across broken drywall, exposed studs, the dark cavity that had swallowed so much silence. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste. My son pressed his face into my side. I could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, fast, uneven. I kept one hand on the back of his head, steady, anchoring him to something solid. To me. "It's okay," I said, not because it was true, but because he needed to hear my voice say it. An officer crouched near the opening in the wall, shining his light downward. "Sir," he said carefully, "we're going to need you to step back." I didn't want to let go. Every instinct in me screamed to keep my body between my son and whatever else was hidden there. But another part of me, older, heavier, understood that protection sometimes means letting others take over. I guided my son toward the living room. He resisted just a little, his fingers tightening in my shirt. "I'm not leaving you," he whispered. "I know," I said. "I'm right here." He sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket someone had handed him. I knelt in front of him, eye level, making sure he could see my face. "Whatever happens next," I told him, "you stay with me. You hear my voice, okay?" He nodded. Behind us, the house filled with quiet urgency. Radios murmured. Shoes crunched over debris. The wall that had once separated what we saw from what we didn't was now just a jagged memory. "Sir," another officer said, "we found something." I stood. They had widened the opening, peeling back drywall like skin. The lower cavity was clearer now, an illegal crawlspace cut beneath the floor, reinforced just enough to hold weight. It wasn't new. The wood was worn smooth in places, darkened by hands. And there were signs. Scratches etched into the studs. Faded tally marks carved into the beam. A folded blanket shoved into a corner. My stomach dropped. The man they pulled out earlier sat on the floor near the kitchen, wrapped in another blanket, shaking. He looked older up close. Gaunt. Like someone who'd been living without daylight. A medic checked his vitals while he stared at nothing. "Do you know him?" an officer asked me. I shook my head. "No." My mother-in-law stood near the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, posture composed. Too composed. She watched the process with the same calm interest she'd always had when correcting my parenting, my career choices, my tone. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "You're all overreacting." An officer turned to her. "Ma'am, please step back." She did, slowly as if indulging a child. I looked at my wife. She sat rigid in a chair, face pale, eyes unfocused. When our gazes met, she looked away. "How long?" I asked her quietly. Her jaw trembled. "I didn't know everything," she said. That answer landed like a lie dressed as mercy. The officer nearest the wall called out, "There's more down here." My chest tightened. They pulled out a plastic container next. Inside were items that didn't belong together. Children's books, bottles of water, a padlock, a roll of fabric strips identical to what had bound my son's wrists. I closed my eyes. This wasn't discipline. It was a system. My mother-in-law finally spoke again, her voice sharper now. "You're all acting like he was hurt." I turned on her. "He was tied inside a wall." She shrugged. "He was safe. Federal watched." "Watched by who?" She glanced toward the man on the floor. The room went still. The realization spread slowly, like cold. This wasn't one secret. It was a structure. I thought about the tally marks. The way my son asked permission to speak. The locked doors. The cleaning smells meant to erase time. "How long has this been happening?" an officer asked. My wife whispered, "Since he started talking back." I felt something tear loose inside me. I remembered the first time my son had questioned a rule. The way my mother-in-law had smiled thinly and said, "Boys need to be broken early." I remembered laughing it off, calling it old-fashioned. I hadn't been absent. I had been convenient. The officers moved efficiently after that. Statements, photos, evidence bags. The house transformed into a place of record, not memory. Every step documented. Every corner exposed. A social worker arrived and knelt beside my son, speaking softly, explaining things in words he could understand. He stayed close to me, his hand gripping mine under the blanket. "You did nothing wrong," she told him. He looked up at me, searching. I nodded. "She's right." He swallowed. "I tried to be good." My chest cracked open. "You were good," I said. "You were brave." Tears slid down his face, silent and heavy. The officers returned to the wall one last time. One of them reached deep into the cavity and pulled something out carefully. A shoe. Not my son's. The air left my lungs. An officer met my eyes. "We're expanding the investigation." I understood what he wasn't saying. My mother-in-law began to protest, her voice rising, words spilling faster now. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything. Families discipline their children differently." She didn't finish the sentence. Handcuffs clicked shut. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked afraid. As they led her away, she twisted back toward me. "You think this makes you strong?" she said. "You think he'll thank you?" I didn't answer. My son pressed his face into my side again. Outside, red and blue lights washed over the lawn. Neighbors stood at a distance, pretending not to stare. The house looked smaller from the outside. Less powerful. Just wood and paint and lies. An officer handed me a card. "We'll be in touch." I nodded. When the door finally closed and the noise faded, the silence felt different. Not empty. Exposed. I sat on the floor with my son in my lap, surrounded by broken walls and open spaces. "I thought I was protecting you by working," I said quietly. "By keeping things calm." He rested his head against my chest. "I knew you'd come," he said. The words cut deeper than any accusation. I held him tighter, surrounded by the truth I could no longer avoid. The wall was gone. But what it had been hiding wasn't just a man or a crawlspace or a crime. It was every moment I'd chosen comfort over courage. And now that I'd seen it, there was no pretending my life could go back to the way it was. Because some walls, once broken, don't just reveal monsters. They reveal who you've been, and who you have to become next. The house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like a place where the truth had finally decided to stay. After the last officer left, the silence pressed in from every direction. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet that follows impact, when everything is still because nothing knows how to move yet. Drywall dust coated the floor like a pale film. The wall stood open, ribs exposed, refusing to be forgotten. My son slept on the couch, exhausted into stillness, his small chest rising and falling against my arm. Every breath felt like a promise I hadn't earned until now. I watched him the way you watch something fragile after it almost breaks, afraid to blink. My wife stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The light above her cast shadows that made her look unfamiliar. Smaller. Like someone who had been living inside a version of herself that was no longer sustainable. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't answer right away. I kept my eyes on our son, on the way his fingers twitched in his sleep, like he was still holding on. Not here, I said. Not near him. She nodded and stepped into the hallway. I followed, careful to keep my voice low, careful in a way I had never been before. She didn't look at me when she spoke. I didn't know it would go this far. That sentence landed between us, heavy and useless. How far did you know? I asked. She closed her eyes. My mother said it was discipline. That boys need fear before they learn respect. I waited. She said you were weak, my wife continued quietly. That you wouldn't understand. That if you found out, you'd ruin everything. I felt something shift, not anger this time. You let her hurt him, I said. She shook her head, tears spilling now. I let her help. The difference mattered to her. It didn't to me. We can still fix this, she said quickly, like speed might change reality. We'll move. Cut contact. I'll do anything. Just don't burn our lives down. I thought about my job. The emails piling up. The meetings I'd miss because of statements and court dates. I thought about how quickly companies distance themselves from messes they didn't cause. I thought about the quiet pride I'd carried for years, being stable, dependable, the man who didn't rock the boat. And I thought about my son inside that wall. There is no fixing this, I said. There's only telling the truth. Her voice broke. They'll take him away. No, I said. They'll protect him. She looked at me then, really looked, like she was seeing a stranger wearing my face. You're choosing them over me. I didn't hesitate. I'm choosing him over everything. The words felt clean. Final. She sank onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, I almost reached for her. Habit tried to pull me back into place, to comfort, to smooth, to make things quieter. Then I remembered the tally marks. I stepped away. The knock came just before dawn. 2 officers. A social worker. Calm voices. Gentle explanations. They spoke to me like someone who had already crossed a line they understood. We need to place your son temporarily, the social worker said. Just until we complete assessments. My chest tightened. Where? With you, she said. Provided you agree to certain conditions. Relief hit so hard I had to sit down. They explained the process. Supervision. Interviews. Therapy. Words that carried weight but also direction. This wasn't chaos. This was structure. My wife stood behind me, silent. When the social worker turned to her, she didn't answer the questions directly. She deferred. Hesitated. Looked to me like I could still save her. I didn't. By noon, the house filled again, this time with consequences. My phone buzzed nonstop. My manager's name flashed across the screen. Where are you? He asked when I answered. At home. Something's going on, he said carefully. HR's been contacted. I know, I said. The pause. We need to talk about optics. I closed my eyes. I don't. The line went quiet. When the call ended, I felt lighter than I had in years. That afternoon, I packed a bag for my wife. She stood in the doorway watching me, disbelief slowly turning into something sharper. You're throwing me out, she said. I'm creating space, I replied. For him. And for the truth. She laughed bitterly. You think this makes you a hero? No, I said. It makes me responsible. She left before sunset. The house felt different immediately. Quieter. Not empty, aligned. That night, my son crawled into bed beside me without asking. His body curled instinctively toward mine, like it finally trusted gravity again. Daddy, he whispered. I'm here. You didn't listen before, he said. I swallowed. I know. But you did now. Yes. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 24 hours. The wall. The hammer. The choice. I knew what was coming. Court dates. Therapy. Financial fallout. Conversations that would cost me people who preferred comfort over truth. I also knew something else. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't negotiating with fear. I had chosen. And when a man finally does that, really does, it doesn't just end a marriage. It ends the lie he's been living inside. Somewhere down the hall, the broken wall waited, open and honest in its destruction. I didn't look away. Because I wasn't afraid of what it showed me anymore. The world didn't clap when the truth came out. It didn't slow down either. It kept moving, emails still arrived, bills still came due, traffic still snarled at the same intersections, like nothing sacred had been exposed inside my house. Like the sound of a wall breaking meant nothing outside of it. That was the first lesson of telling the truth as an adult man. You don't get applause. You get consequences. The days after everything happened blurred together, stitched by routines I didn't recognize as survival until much later. I woke up before my alarm. I checked on my son before checking my phone. I cooked meals I barely tasted. I answered questions from people who wrote everything down and nodded slowly, like gravity itself required documentation. The caseworker came twice a week at first. She was calm, neutral. The kind of professional kindness that doesn't assume innocence or guilt, it waits. She watched how my son leaned into me when she entered the room. How he glanced at my face before answering her questions. How his shoulders dropped when I put a hand on his back. "These things matter," she said once, quietly. I didn't respond. I just kept doing them. That was my strategy. Not convincing. Not explaining. Consistency. The house felt watched even when it was empty. I caught myself narrating my actions in my head, like someone might be taking notes. He's brushing his teeth. He's packing lunch. He's being careful. It took weeks before I realized that voice wasn't for them. It was for me. Sleep came in fragments. Some nights I dreamed of the wall, endless walls, stretching hallway after hallway, every one of them hollow. Other nights I dreamed of nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. My son had nightmares at first. He'd wake up gasping, eyes wide, searching the room like it might change shapes when he wasn't looking. I never told him it was okay. I told him the truth. "You're safe right now," I'd say. "I'm here. The door is locked. The house is quiet." Concrete things. Verifiable things. He trusted those. One afternoon, while he was at school, I finally listened to the voicemails. My manager's voice was tight. Controlled. "Given the circumstances, we're placing you on indefinite leave." Another message followed. "This is about protecting the company." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was honest in a way no one intended. Protection had a cost. It always does. I cleaned out my desk the next morning. No scene. No speeches. Just a cardboard box and the quiet understanding that I wouldn't be coming back. Some people avoided my eyes. Others tried too hard to meet them. One man I'd worked beside for years pulled me aside. "I heard some things," he said. "I don't know what's true." "That makes two of us," I replied. He nodded, relieved. Not because he believed me, but because I hadn't asked him to. Money tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. I canceled subscriptions. Stopped ordering out. Learned which expenses were habits and which were anchors. At night, after my son fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall schedule the court had given me. Dates. Steps. Processes. It wasn't overwhelming. It was relentless. And that was worse. Friends reached out, some sincerely, some carefully, like they were testing the temperature of the room before stepping inside. A few disappeared completely. I didn't chase them. For the first time in my life, I understood that not everyone who leaves is a loss. One evening, my son asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. "Are we the bad guys?" The word hit me harder than any accusation from an adult. I crouched in front of him, eye level. "No," I said. "We're the ones who told." He thought about that. "That's different." "Yes," I said. "Sometimes it looks worse at first. But it's the only way things get better." He nodded slowly, filing it away. I hoped the world wouldn't try to convince him otherwise. Therapy started. For him first. I sat in the waiting room, listening to muted voices through thin walls, my leg bouncing like it used to before big meetings. When the therapist finally invited me in, she didn't start with questions. She said, "He trusts you." I swallowed. That's not something we take lightly. Later, it was my turn. I didn't know what to say at first. I'd spent years performing competence, not examining it. I miss signs, I said finally. Yes, she replied. And you responded when you saw them. The difference sat between us. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Weeks passed. The caseworker's visits shortened. Her pen moved less. Sometimes she just watched us eat dinner, the normalcy speaking louder than anything I could say. You're stable, she told me one afternoon. I didn't feel stable. I felt awake. There's a difference. One night, after my son went to bed, I stood in front of the broken wall. I ran my hand along the exposed studs, the rough wood grounding me. This wasn't a wound anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that denial could be broken. Evidence that I could choose differently. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Normal. Unchanged. Inside, everything had shifted. I knew then that the hardest part wasn't behind me. It was ahead, living a life where I could never again pretend not to hear. But for the first time, that didn't scare me. It steadied me. Because whatever this cost me, career, marriage, reputation, it had already given me something back. My son slept peacefully down the hall. And I was finally the kind of man who could hear the house breathe. The truth hadn't saved me. But it had aligned me. And that, I was learning, was enough to rebuild everything else. The wall never got fixed. Not right away. Weeks passed, then months, and still that section of the house stayed exposed. Wooden studs like ribs, the dark cavity where my son had been hidden now empty and quiet. Contractors gave me estimates. Friends suggested quick repairs, clean finishes, ways to make it disappear. I kept saying the same thing. Not yet. Because every time I looked at it, I remembered who I had been before the hammer. The man who ignored sounds. The man who trusted silence because it was easier than asking hard questions. The man who thought keeping everything intact mattered more than knowing what was inside. That man didn't live here anymore. Life settled into a shape I didn't recognize at first. Morning routines. Therapy appointments. School drop-offs that came with extra paperwork and cautious smiles from other parents. My son's backpack always a little too big for his shoulders, his grip on my hand a little tighter than it used to be. He slept through the night now. That alone felt like a miracle. Sometimes he'd wake up early and sit at the kitchen table while I made coffee, humming softly to himself. A sound so small and ordinary I had to fight the urge to cry every time I heard it. The caseworker visited less often. The questions became gentler. Notes were taken, but no longer with suspicion, more like confirmation. "You're doing well," she told me one afternoon. I nodded. I didn't say thank you. This wasn't something you celebrated. It was something you maintained. Work eventually called back. Not my old job. That door stayed closed, quietly but firmly. Instead, it was a smaller firm. Less pay. Fewer hours. More flexibility. Your situation came up, the hiring manager said during the interview. We don't need details. We just need to know where your priorities are. I didn't rehearse the answer. My son, I said. She smiled once. Then we're aligned. Alignment. The word stayed with me. Because for the first time in my life, my choices matched my values instead of negotiating with them. My wife didn't fight the divorce. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. Clean signatures. Short emails. No long explanations. When it was done, I felt something close to grief, but not for the marriage. For the version of myself that thought it was enough. My mother-in-law was charged. I didn't attend every hearing. I didn't need to. Justice wasn't something I had to witness to believe in anymore. Knowing I had acted, that was enough. One evening, months later, my son stood in front of the open wall holding a crayon. "Can I draw here?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. He knelt and began to draw directly on the exposed wood. Lines. Ships. Stick figures holding hands. A sun in the corner, oversized and unapologetic. "What is it?" I asked. "It's where I stopped being scared," he said. My throat closed. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone on the floor and finally cried. Not the sharp kind. Not the panicked kind. The kind that comes when something heavy is finally put down. I understood then that healing wasn't about erasing the damage. It was about refusing to hide it. A month later, I fixed the wall, but not completely. I installed a panel that could be opened. Hidden hinges. A quiet door that blended into the room unless you knew where to look. When the contractor asked why, I said, "So I don't forget." On my son's birthday, we painted the room together. New colors. Bright ones. He chose yellow. "Because it feels like morning," he said. I believed him. That night, after the cake and the candles and the mess, I tucked him into bed. "Daddy." "Yeah. You hear things now," he said. "I do. Even small sounds." "Yes." He smiled, already drifting. "That's good." When I turned off the light, I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, listening. To the house. To the quiet. To the absence of fear. The wall stood solid now, but honest. And so did I. Because the truth is, being a man isn't about holding everything together. It's about knowing when to break something open. So the people you love can finally breathe.